Hey, welcome to Unity Animation Foundations. We're gonna go over the animator for animation states, when and when not to use them. We're also gonna go over the other window for animation. We're gonna cover keyframes and the curves. We're gonna do a ball idle, a pulse animation, and go over some tips for using those. First thing that we wanna do is get a scene set up. So I'm going to go into my scenes, go ahead and create a new scene here. Go ahead and double click our scene. I'm going to go to my prefabs and drag in a floor. Now, of course, you could just use a plane to follow along. I'm going to have all of the asset packs that I use linked in the description. First thing I'm going to do is go to my ground floor here. And I'm going to reset the transforms. Press F to frame it, or you can double click your floor inside the hierarchy. So this is where we'll have our ball. Go ahead and create a ball for our animation. So we'll do a 3D sphere. And let's go ahead and reset everything and bring it up 0.5 so it's on top of our ground. And then we could grab a material, whether you create your own or make one. Oh, I think this nice shiny one, if you want to learn about that, set that up. Check in the description for more info, but here we're just putting on a map and turning up the metallic and the smoothness. And then we'll save this. So now that we got our basic scene set up, now to prepare the ball for animation. So here's tip number 1. So being that I'm going to potentially animate the position, the rotation, and the scale, I'm then not going to be able to move it around the scene as is, as an object. But what I can do is create a parent and move that around. So I'm going to actually animate this object and then parent it. So I could go ahead and create an empty, call it ball parent, and I'm just going to go ahead and reset all of the transforms so it's center. So I don't need to necessarily parent them right now, but I am going to drag my ball down so it's just at the bottom. But I will parent to this at some point. You could parent it right away or parent it after. I'd probably parent it after, especially if you're just starting out with animation. So we have our ball here, and we've got a couple things on it, right? We've got our mesh filter with our mesh renderer. We've got the sphere collider, our transform. And what we want to do now is create an animation. So the first thing that we'll do is actually go up to Window, Animation, and get our animation window. So also Control 6. Now this window we can drag wherever we'd like to. Maybe I will, let's see, get it to where I can snap it here. There we go. So with the ball selected in our animation window, it lets you know that we currently don't have any animation clips. And so we can click Create for the first time to create our first animation. Now, it's going to ask us about saving the clip or the file. You can think of this as almost like it's going to be a video clip of whatever animation. So we're going to call this ball _ idle. And I'm going to go into just my assets folder. And I don't have an animation folder. So on a PC, I can just right click, create a new folder, and just name it anim. And this is on Windows, but it's going to be in my game project. So I can go into that folder and there will be my animations. And as this gets bigger and bigger and I'm creating other animations, I may group them in the folders for each object. But for right now, we can just save it directly in here, ball animation, and we'll save that. So as soon as we do that, we get an animator component on our ball, which then has some information here. So this animator is what is going to connect our animation clip that we're about to create, and it will put it and connect it with the animation state machine. And this is for just like when you make a character and you have a walk, run, idle, jump, slide, crouch. All of those are different states in here for the animation. So you can think of the states as video clips. So our idle will be a video clip, right, of the ball idling, and then we're going to have a ball pulsing, and then a ball bouncing. And we'll have each of those states, and so in here we can kind of set up some conditions about when it's going to play what animation. And our actual game object here, this animator, is what is talking to those states with this actual object in our game, saying, hey, these states are connected to this, and to use those. So the first thing that we can do is create a property. So our clip is called ball idle, and we'll do add property. And here is a list of things that we could animate and grab. So we can go into our transforms. We want to say maybe animate the position. We'll just start with that. So when I click that, now we get a position, and it keyframes the X, Y, and Z position at 0 and out here. Now, the next tip, we also want to set up our timeline to be able to view a couple of things. So the first thing that we want to do is our timeline. You get 2 vertical ellipse menus, right? Where you get this vertical stacking of these ellipses. So the top one is going to be kind of the menu for the actual animation window. And then this one right here below that is for the timeline. So we can click that. We have a couple things. We could view our timeline in seconds or in frames. We could show sample rate, which you want to make sure that's turned on. Whoops. Turn that back on. And that will allow us to kind of see what the sample rate is. So here we have essentially a second, where if I click play, and you can see it's as I scroll through or scrub the timeline, you can see this number here changes, which is telling us what keyframe we are on. And you can see when I get from 59 to 60, there's this 1 here representing 1 second. So it goes from 0 to 60 in 1 second. So we have 60 frames. So for some really smooth animation, we could use 60, but really we don't need that right now. We can do 24. Now, this is a whole nother deep topic, like the history of animation and film production, where typically video is 24 frames per second, right? So we'll just do 24 for right now. So we can hit enter, and that'll mean in 24 frames, it will be 1 second. So what I could do is just bring this back down. So where it was at 60, it left the timeline just as big. So now 24 frames was shorter than before. And here you can see my sliders where I can zoom in and out. So now to create keyframes, I can come forward maybe to about 8. And you can see, like maybe I want to move this up on the Y. So on the Y, we changed it. So I could do that. And here we can click the keyframe drop down and do add key. And then where my slider is, it puts a key. Now, if you actually did that over here, you can also drag these keys just by clicking and dragging. And these keyframes represent a change in the position for each one. So in this case, since I only moved the Y, it only put keyframes for the Y. That's it. So you can see from here to here it goes up. And then maybe I want to do another one, and then I could just delete these numbers, put it at 0.5, and it put a keyframe kind of automatically. And then I'll come forward here. See, what was this one? We'll do maybe do 0.55. Oops. Point. Keyboard's wigging out a little bit here. I could kind of space these out. So we've got this Y. You can see the top keyframes here. You get keyframes that identify where there's animated keyframes at. The second line is just showing us, hey, the position is keyed at these marks. And then if I drop that down, you can see the X only has a beginning and an end. The Y is the one that we've done every single time. And the Z just has a beginning and end. So we kind of get this floaty feel. And what we can do is just click play. And that will give us our animation. And then we can easily come in here and just go, okay, maybe 5.5 is too much. Maybe we'll do 5.1, hit enter. And you can see that keeps that. I just drag or scrub the timeline to that spot. And then I can go in and change that to 5.1. Kind of make it a little bit more subtler. We'll call that the idle animation. So that's kind of the basic principle behind it. So if we were typically for some of the sprites, we might do samples for 12 and get that real snappy animated look for 2D games. And we'll just kind of do 24 for right now. And we could do 60 for things that we really need something really, really smooth. But that's kind of a good start on that. All right, for tip number 3, I'm going to show you how to record the animation, the keyframes, a little bit differently. But first, we need to create a new clip. So we have our idle. We're going to actually click on that on our animation window. And we're going to do that drop down and do create new clip. Here again, we want to save to that same folder. And we'll call this ball underscore. And we'll do this one pulse. So we're going to kind of make the ball pulse or scale. And we'll save this one in that same location. Now with the ball pulse, instead of adding property, so we could add properties to record. And we could change the keyframes for multiple properties, right? Just like we can go back to the idle, I could select multiple keyframes and move them as well. But we're going to switch again back to the pulse. And then now on our playhead area, we're going to click the record button. What this does is anything that we change, it's going to record the keyframe. And it's going to automatically create a keyframe at 0. And what we want to do is we have move, rotate, and scale. And you could also just press R for rail. I like to call it rail. Helps me remember it. But we're going to rail this ball up. But R on the keyboard or the icon here. And you can see our scale is numbers. We could change that too. But I'm going to move out maybe 1/3 of the way instead of, and we don't need 60 seconds. Let's do back to 24, right? Standard for movies. So it looks like it's about 8 frames in here. And I'm going to then go ahead and scale this up a little bit. Now what it actually did here is it didn't put the keyframe at 8 frames. It put it at all the way at the end. And I scaled on the X, Y, and Z. What we can do is just drag select to get all of these keyframes here. And I'm just going to drag them down to 8. So it goes from 0 to 8. And then I'm going to go to the 24 frame mark. So we're going to make our timeline a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to go ahead and change the numbers back to 1. There we go. So now we've got going from 0, it's a scale of 1, to 8, going from a scale of 1.1945, and then to 20. Now, it's still got record going. So let's say, even if I added in at 12, I could drag my slider here and scale it. I don't know why it didn't before, but you can see now it's doing what it's supposed to. It created the keyframes at 12. And then I can, if I don't want to accidentally create any more keyframes, I want to turn off record. Now I can still move keyframes around, but it's no longer recording and creating keyframes. Now I kind of have like a pulsing heartbeat ball animation. And I could kind of change these around. I could drag select and move them and see. See where I might like those. But just a little bit of scale so we get this pulsing feel to that. Now currently we're in what's called the dope sheet, which is the sheet that we can see all of the keyframes in. But if we go to our curves sheet, our curves is going to have the keyframes. And what the curves does, it allows us to modify the transition in between keyframes, or they call it the in-betweens, right? Or the tweens. So going from frame 0 to 3, you can see it kind of has this, it eases out from the first frame and then starts to ease in to the next frame. And we can change those up. So each one of these we can be able to right click, and we have some settings where we can change those. And we'll go over that more later, but this is just for controlling, like we said, the transition in between keyframes. Gives you a little bit more control, essentially. So now that we've got our clips, where are those? Well, if we go back to our project window, look at our anim folder, you can see on our ball, we have this animator component here, and it shows you that it created an animator controller called ball. That is this icon here. Looks like this is the state icon. You got two states connected with these blue square lines, you know, like arrows pointing to each other. So this, when we click on it, shows ball controller. This is going to be the state controller or state machine or animator controller. And then these are currently the anim files, which, like I said, are like movie clips. So we have ball idle, and you only have a couple settings here, but for this loop time, we want it to loop because it's the idle. And ball pulse, we maybe want that to loop too, maybe. Just depends. For some animations, you're not going to necessarily have them loop, but for something like this that you want to loop, I think that works pretty well. Now, we can just click on our animator window, or we can double click the ball controller, and it'll also bring that window up here. Here we have our state machine. So, in each of these allows us to do certain things. So automatically, when you enter the entry or when the game starts, it's going to go to the default state and play that animation. And that was, by default, whatever we created first. Now, we could change that. Right now, it's set to ball idle. So in my game view, or in my scene view, if I click play and play test it, the ball is going to idle. If I wanted to change that to pulse, all I have to do is right click and do set as default state, right? Then the ball pulse animation will automatically play as the default. And you can have this arrow here. This is just the default entry arrow, just letting you know that when you enter, it's going to automatically go to idle first thing. These are other ones that we can set up or connect to. So we have any state and we have exit. And for the ball with idle and pulse, we can also have these connected to each other where we can transition. Say we want to press the space bar and go from idle to pulse. And then we press the space bar again and it goes from pulse to idle. So to do that, we would right click on idle and do make transition. And then it gives us this arrow that we could connect to pulse. So it goes from ball, idle to pulse. Now, when you click on the arrow, that's when you can see here, you get a little preview, but that's where we'd want to have a condition of, well, what is the condition for it to go from idle to pulse? And with that, we're not going to cover layers right now, but we have parameters that we would use for that. And there are 4 parameters. We could do a float, an integer, a bool, or a trigger. So we could literally just trigger this, right? Or we could do a Boolean. And we'll go over that more later, but those are the 4 conditions that we can use. And there's also then 4 ways of writing the code to connect to these, which then we would use to go back and forth. Same thing with pulse to idle. I might right click, do make transition, and it could go back to the idle. Now for right now, I don't need these transitions because we don't have anything. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete on the keyboard those transitions. Of course, we want to save where we're at. I can drag my game view over so I can see what my camera sees and click play. I think the last thing we set up was the ball idle, right? What's that? Yeah, there we go. So we have kind of the ball idling right here. And if we go to the animator, you'll actually see that it's looping and playing this animation. And that's how much time, when that blue bar goes across, how much time it's playing. So now that we got 2 animations set up, back to tip number 1, what we can do is just drag our ball object onto the ball parent. So our ball object becomes the child, and we have the ball parent. So our ball, its transform is going to be the local location versus the ball parent is now the world coordinates or the world location. So I can take the ball parent and move it wherever, and clicking play, you can see here when it plays, it'll play that animation. So I can be able to animate it, rotating, scaling, doing whatever I'd like, and I can move it around the scene, no problem. And we'll do the same thing for the ball bounce and for animating a door as well here soon. The last tip that I want to give is about the animator. And I mentioned before, when and why would you use these states and transitions? So even in a 2D game, you're going to create states. But typically, I don't use the transitions because I'm going to call those animations automatically from code when I want them to play those animations. The state machine and creating all of the transitions and setting up all kinds of different states working together and transitioning around, those are all going to be for typically more of a 3D scene when you're actually wanting to have smooth transitions. Like you want to be able to, say, a walk and a run, you might want to have a jog or something where you're kind of tweening in between those smoothly. So there's a little bit more features. That's kind of a quick definition. We are going to talk about that more later, but that at least gets you the basic understanding of it. So that's a quick intro to the principles with animating inside of Unity. I hope that was helpful. Check out the next video for more tips and tricks and tools on how to animate well in Unity.